The glass walls of the conference room reflected everything except me, and from where I stood in the hallway, I could see my father sliding a thick folder across the polished oak table toward my sister like it had always belonged to her, like I had never spent 10 years learning every inch of that company from the inside out, like my name had never been attached to anything that mattered, and Olivia smiled the way she always did when something was handed to her. Calm, practiced, effortless. While the rest of the board nodded along as if this moment had been decided years ago, maybe it had, maybe I just hadn't been invited to the meeting where my future was erased. And when my mother glanced toward the door and noticed me standing there, she didn't look surprised, she looked annoyed, like I had shown up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, and she mouthed 2 words through the glass, "Not now," and I understood exactly what she meant. Not now meant not ever. Not now meant this isn't your place. Not now meant you were never part of this decision. But what they didn't know, what none of them understood as my father uncapped his pen and began explaining ownership percentages and executive authority, was that my name was already printed on a document sitting inside that same folder, buried under layers of paperwork they hadn't bothered to read carefully, because why would they? They thought they controlled everything. They thought giving Olivia the company was as simple as announcing it in a room full of witnesses, but there are things in business that don't care about announcements, things that don't respond to favoritism or family dinners or who got praised more growing up, and I had learned those things a long time ago, quietly, invisibly, the way I learned everything else in that house, by watching, by listening, by being the one no one noticed, and that invisibility had been my greatest weakness for most of my life, until it became the one advantage they could never take from me, because while Olivia was being introduced to investors and flown to conferences and praised for her natural leadership, I was the one sitting in back offices going through contracts, shadowing compliance meetings, asking questions no one else wanted to ask, and more importantly, I was the one my grandmother trusted when she started stepping back from the company 2 years ago, the only one she would sit down with late at night in her study, the only one she would explain the real structure to, not the version my parents liked to show off, but the one that actually controlled everything beneath the surface. And I didn't understand it all at first, I'll admit that, but I understood enough to know that ownership isn't always about who stands at the front of the room. And as I watched Olivia reach for the pen my father handed her, laughing softly as someone congratulated her, I realized something else, something that made my chest tighten but my hands stay completely still. They had already made their move, they had already decided I didn't matter, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to interrupt them, I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to ask to be included, because sometimes the most powerful position you can be in is the one no one sees coming. And as the pen hovered just above the signature line, I noticed the lawyer at the end of the table shift slightly in his seat, his eyes scanning the document one more time, slower this time, more carefully, like he had just realized something didn't quite line up, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't over, not even close, because the final signature they were about to celebrate had never actually belonged to Olivia in the first place, and they were about to find that out the hard way. I did not move when Olivia lowered the pen to the paper, and that alone should have told them something was off, because I had spent my entire life reacting, explaining, trying to be seen. But this time I just watched as the tip of the pen touched the signature line, and my father leaned back slightly in his chair with that quiet satisfaction he always had when things went according to plan, and my mother folded her hands in her lap like this was a moment worth remembering, like this was the official passing of something meaningful, and Olivia signed her name in one smooth motion, confident, practiced, exactly the way she had signed everything else that had ever been handed to her. And for a second the room held that soft pause that comes after a decision is made, that invisible moment where everyone waits for confirmation that everything is complete, but it did not come, because at the far end of the table Michael Reeves did not nod, he did not gather the papers, he did not say congratulations, instead he kept looking down at the document, his finger resting on a line halfway down the page, as if he was rereading it for the first time, and my father noticed it almost immediately. I could tell by the way his shoulders stiffened just slightly, and he leaned forward, tapping the table once with his knuckles and saying, "Is there a problem?" in that controlled voice he used when he expected a simple no. But Michael did not answer right away. He adjusted his glasses, flipped back one page, then another, scanning more carefully now, and the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that even Olivia's smile faded just a little, and I felt something settle in my chest, something steady, because I had seen that exact look before, not here, not in this room, but 2 years ago in a much smaller office when my grandmother had slid a stack of documents across to him and said, "Read it again, Michael, not the summary, the structure," and he had looked confused at first, then focused, then quiet in the same way he was now. And back then I had been sitting in the corner. Not part of the conversation, just another invisible presence, but my grandmother had glanced at me once, just once, and said, "You are the only one who listens long enough to understand what matters." And I did not fully understand what she meant at the time, not until she began walking me through the layers beneath the company, not the titles or the roles or the public ownership percentages, but the trust, the clauses, the conditions that most people skipped because they assumed they would never apply. And now, watching Michael trace that same section with his finger, I knew exactly which part he had found, the clause that did not announce itself, the one that sat quietly between lines of standard language, waiting for someone to actually read it, and my father's patience was thinning. I could hear it in the sharper edge of his voice when he repeated, "Michael," this time with less politeness and more expectation. And finally Michael looked up, not at Olivia, not at the board, but directly at my father, and said, "This signature is not sufficient to finalize the transfer." And for the first time since I had walked into that hallway, the room actually reacted, not loudly, but with small, immediate shifts, chairs adjusting, glances exchanged, Olivia turning slightly in her seat as if she had misheard, and my mother straightening, her hands tightening together, and my father frowned, not confused yet, just irritated, because in his mind there was no scenario where this did not go through. "What do you mean not sufficient?" he asked, and Michael turned the document toward him, tapping the same line he had been reading. "The transfer requires authorization from the primary beneficiary of the Carter Trust," he said, calm, precise, like he was reading from something he could not ignore. And there was a beat of silence that followed, just long enough for my father to process the words, just long enough for Olivia to glance down at the page again, searching for something she had missed, and just long enough for me to step away from the glass wall and finally open the door, because this was the moment my grandmother had prepared for, the one she had hinted at, without ever fully explaining. And as every head in the room turned toward me, I realized something else, something that made everything suddenly very clear. They had spent years deciding I did not belong here. But the system they trusted more than anything else had already decided otherwise, and they were only just beginning to understand it. The sound of the door opening was softer than I expected, but it still cut through the room like something out of place, and every conversation, every breath, every quiet assumption stopped at once as I stepped inside. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for them to see me clearly for the first time that day, and my father's expression shifted immediately. From irritation to something tighter, something controlled, like he was already preparing to dismiss whatever I was about to say. "This is a closed meeting," he said, his voice firm, practiced, the same tone he used when shutting down conversations he did not want to have. But I did not stop walking. I moved toward the table slowly, my eyes not on him, not even on Olivia, but on the document still lying open between them, the one that had just changed the entire direction of the room without them realizing how far it would go. And I said, "You might want to finish reading that before you finalize anything." And for a second no one responded, because they were not used to me speaking like that, not here, not in this room, not in front of people who mattered. And Olivia let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind she used when something did not fit her version of reality. "Emily, this is not your concern," she said, already turning back toward the table as if that ended it. But Michael did not move. His eyes shifted from me to her, then back to the page, and I could see it now, the full recognition settling in, the same realization my grandmother had forced him to confront before. And my father leaned forward again, his patience gone now, replaced with something sharper. "If there is a procedural issue, we can resolve it after this meeting," he said, already reaching for the document as if he could push the moment forward by force. But Michael placed his hand flat against the page, stopping it from being moved, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear that this was not something that could be ignored. "It cannot be resolved after," he said, his tone steady, but different now, more formal, more precise, like he had stepped into a role none of them expected him to play. "The clause requires authorization before any transfer is considered valid." And Olivia turned fully this time, her brows tightening, confusion replacing confidence in a way I had never seen before. "Authorization from who?" she asked. And for the first time since I had entered the room, I allowed myself to look directly at her, not with anger, not with anything she could argue against, just calm, just certainty, because this was not about convincing them anymore. The structure had already done that for me. "From the primary beneficiary of the Carter Trust," I said, repeating the words exactly as they were written, and my mother's head snapped slightly toward Michael as if waiting for him to correct me, to say I was misunderstanding something, to restore the version of reality she was comfortable with, but he did not. He simply nodded once, confirming it, and the silence that followed was heavier this time, not confused, not uncertain but shifting, like the ground under them had moved and they were only just noticing it. And my father's voice came out slower now, more deliberate. "And who exactly is that?" he asked, and there it was, the question they had never thought to ask, the one detail they had assumed was already in their control, and for a brief second I saw it, the flicker of doubt, the first crack in the certainty they had built around Olivia for years. And I thought about the nights in my grandmother's study, the way she had insisted I read every page, every line, even when it felt repetitive, even when I thought I understood it already. "You do not understand it until you can explain why it exists," she had said, and now I did, every piece of it, every condition, every safeguard she had put in place, not to create conflict, but to make sure the company could never be handed to someone who did not truly understand it. And as I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin, sealed envelope, the same one she had given me the last time I saw her, I realized this was the moment she had been preparing me for all along. Not a confrontation, not an argument, but a correction, a quiet, undeniable shift in who actually held the power. And as I placed the envelope on the table in front of Michael, I said, "You might want to open that," because what they were about to see was not just a clause, not just a technicality, it was the part of the structure they had completely overlooked, the part that made everything they had just done meaningless without one final decision they never imagined would belong to me. Michael did not open the envelope right away, and that hesitation alone changed the entire atmosphere in the room, because a moment ago everything had been moving forward with certainty, with momentum, but now there was pause, calculation, and something else underneath it, something none of them wanted to name yet, and my father exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that meant he was trying to keep authority in a situation that was slipping just enough to be noticeable. "Emily, whatever this is, you are out of line," he said. But his voice no longer carried the same weight it had 5 minutes ago, because authority only works when no one questions it, and now the question was already on the table, sitting right there between us in a sealed envelope no one could ignore, and Olivia shifted in her chair, her confidence thinning into impatience. "This is unnecessary," she said, her tone sharper now, directed more at Michael than at me, as if he had become the problem, as if this delay was his fault for not moving things along. But Michael finally reached for the envelope, turning it over once in his hands, reading the name written across the front in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, and I saw something settle in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, recognition, the kind that comes when a detail you once dismissed suddenly becomes the only thing that matters. And he broke the seal carefully, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, like he understood that whatever was inside was about to redefine the conversation completely, and no one spoke while he unfolded the document inside, not even my father, because something about the way Michael handled it made it clear this was no longer a minor procedural issue. And as his eyes moved across the page, line by line, I felt the weight of every late night I had spent in that study with my grandmother, every time she had stopped me and said, "Read it again," every time I thought I understood and she made me go deeper. And now all of that was sitting right here, compressed into a few pages of legal language that most people would skim past without thinking. And when Michael finally looked up, he did not address my father first, he did not address Olivia, he looked directly at me, just for a second, and in that glance was confirmation, not of something new, but of something already decided long before this meeting ever existed. And then he turned the document so the rest of the table could see it, tapping a section halfway down the page. "This is an amendment to the Carter Trust," he said, his voice steady, formal, carrying across the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And my mother leaned forward, her composure tightening. "We have the trust documents," she said quickly, almost defensively. "They were reviewed last year." But Michael shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just factual. "This amendment was filed after that review," he replied, and my father's expression shifted again, this time not irritation, not control, but something closer to realization, the kind that arrives slowly but settles hard. "Filed by who?" he asked, and Michael did not hesitate. "Eleanor Carter," he said, and for a brief moment no one spoke, because even now, even with everything in front of them, they had not fully caught up to what that meant. And Olivia looked back down at the document, scanning faster now, her eyes moving without landing, searching for something that would restore the version of reality she was used to. But it was not there. because the structure my grandmother built was never meant to be obvious, it was meant to be correct. And Michael continued. The amendment specifies that any transfer of controlling interest requires final authorization from the designated primary beneficiary, regardless of board approval or executive assignment. And this time he did not need to explain further, because the implication was already clear, hanging in the space between every person at that table. And my father leaned back slightly, his hands no longer on the document, his control over the moment no longer absolute. And who is designated? He asked, but his voice had changed again. Quieter now, more careful, because somewhere in the back of his mind, he already knew the answer was not going to be Olivia. And I did not rush to speak, I did not interrupt, I let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle over them, for them to feel the gap between what they believed and what was actually written. And then Michael turned one final page, the one that mattered most, the one they had never thought to look for. And as his finger traced the line that confirmed everything, I realized this was the exact moment my grandmother had described without ever saying it directly, the moment where the system would speak louder than any argument, and nothing they said could change it. Because what they had built on assumption was now being replaced by something far more permanent, something they had never accounted for, and something that was about to make one thing very clear: the decision they thought they had already made was never theirs to complete in the first place. Michael's finger stopped on a single line, and for a moment he did not speak, which somehow made it louder than anything he could have said, because everyone at that table leaned forward without realizing it, drawn in by the silence, by the weight of something they could not yet see but could already feel shifting under them. And then he read it, not dramatically, not slowly, just clearly: primary beneficiary, Emily Carter. And the room did not explode. It did not react the way people expect. In stories, instead it went completely still, like the air had been pulled out of it, and I watched the words land one by one, first on my father, then my mother, then Olivia, each of them processing it differently but arriving at the same place: disbelief, not because they did not hear it, but because it did not match anything they believed to be true. And Olivia was the first to speak. "That is not possible," she said, her voice tight, controlled but cracking at the edges. "That has to be outdated or incorrect." And she reached for the document as if touching it would somehow change what was written. But Michael did not let it go immediately. He held it steady, his tone calm but firm. "It is neither outdated nor incorrect," he said. "This amendment was properly filed, witnessed and recorded." And my mother shook her head slightly, already trying to reconstruct the situation into something she could understand. "Eleanor would have told us," she said, almost to herself, almost as if saying it out loud would make it true. But I knew better. I knew exactly why she had not told them, because she had told me instead, not directly, not in one clear statement, but in pieces, in lessons, in questions she made me answer until I understood not just what the structure was but why it existed. And my father's gaze shifted to me now, really shifted, not dismissing, not overlooking, but focusing in a way it never had before, and there was something unfamiliar in it, something between anger and calculation. "When did you know about this?" he asked, and I met his eyes without hesitation. 2 years ago," I said, and that answer alone changed everything again, because it reframed the entire past, every meeting I had not been invited to, every decision they had made without me, every time they assumed I was irrelevant. And Olivia let out a short breath, almost a laugh but without any humor. "So you have just been sitting on this," she said, and there it was, the first real accusation, not about legality, not about structure, but about intent. And I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "I have been learning it." And that landed differently, quieter but heavier, because it suggested something they had not considered, that this was not luck, not a loophole, not an accident, but something built, something prepared. And Michael set the document down fully now, his role no longer passive. "Without Emily's authorization, the transfer cannot be completed," he said, and this time no one interrupted him, no one tried to correct him, because the authority they relied on had just confirmed the one thing they could not argue against. And my father leaned back in his chair, his hands finally still, the certainty that had carried him into this meeting gone, replaced with something far less comfortable: uncertainty. And he looked at Olivia, then back at me, and for the first time, there was no clear next move, no immediate solution, because this was not a negotiation they could control, not a decision they could override. It was a condition already written into the system they trusted more than anything else. And as the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier, I realized something that settled deep and steady inside me. This was not the moment I took something from them. This was the moment they realized they had never actually had it. And as every eye in the room remained fixed on me, waiting, expecting, unsure, I understood that the final step was not about proving anything anymore. It was about deciding what happened next, because the one thing they had never prepared for, the one possibility they had completely overlooked, was that the person they dismissed for years would be the one holding the authority they needed, and now for the first time they had to wait for me. No one spoke for a long time after that, and it was not because they did not have anything to say, it was because for the first time, nothing they said would immediately change the outcome, and that was something none of them were used to, especially not my father, who had built his entire life on being the one who decided how things moved forward, but now he was sitting there, looking at me, waiting, and that shift alone said more than anything else that had happened so far. And Olivia finally leaned forward, her hands pressing lightly against the table as if grounding herself. "This does not change the plan," she said, her voice steadier now, more deliberate, like she was reconstructing control piece by piece. "We can resolve this as a formality." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because she still believed this was a step in a process that would end the way she expected. And my mother nodded slightly beside her, reinforcing it. "Emily, if there is something that needs to be signed, then we can handle that now," she added, her tone softer, more measured, the same tone she used when she wanted something from me without admitting it directly. And I let the silence stretch just a second longer before I spoke, because timing mattered now more than ever. "It is not a formality," I said, and the difference in the room was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle tightening, like a realization settling into place that this was not going to be resolved quickly. And my father's eyes narrowed slightly, studying me in a way that felt entirely new, not dismissing, not overlooking, but evaluating. "Then explain it," he said, and I nodded once, because this was the part my grandmother had prepared me for the most, not the document, not the clause, but the understanding behind it. "The trust does not just assign ownership," I said, my voice calm, steady. "It controls how ownership is transferred." And I could see it landing slowly, piece by piece, because this was not language they used in everyday conversations. This was deeper than titles, deeper than roles, and Olivia leaned back slightly, crossing her arms, defensive now. "You are making this more complicated than it is," she said, but there was less confidence in it this time, less certainty, and I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "I am explaining why it is already complicated." And Michael remained silent, but his posture shifted just enough to confirm what I was saying, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing it to unfold, because this was not his explanation to give anymore, it was mine, and I continued. "The amendment requires that the primary beneficiary does not just approve the transfer, they have to determine whether the transfer aligns with the conditions of the trust." And that was the part that changed everything, the part they had not expected, because approval could be assumed, but evaluation could not, and my mother's expression tightened again. "And what conditions are those?" she asked, and I paused for just a moment, not because I did not know, but because I wanted them to feel the weight of the answer before I gave it. "That the person receiving control demonstrates a full understanding of the operational structure of the company," I said, and this time the silence that followed was different, not just heavy but pointed, because it was no longer about paperwork. It was about qualification, about something measurable but not easily claimed, and Olivia let out a small breath, almost a scoff. "I have been prepared for this my entire life," she said, but even she did not sound entirely convinced anymore, and I met her gaze directly, not with challenge, not with anger, just with clarity. "You have been presented for it," I said, and that distinction landed harder than anything else, because it was not an attack, it was a difference, and my father shifted slightly in his chair, the first sign of discomfort he had not been able to hide, because this was no longer a situation he could direct. It was a system he had not fully understood, and I realized in that moment that the power my grandmother had given me was not in the document itself, it was in the responsibility attached to it, because now the question was not whether I could stop them, the question was whether I would let them move forward at all. And as they all looked at me, waiting for the next step, I understood something else just as clearly. This was not the end of the decision, this was the beginning of it, and whatever happened next was not going to follow the plan they had already written without me. No one argued with that, not immediately, and that silence told me more than anything they could have said, because for the first time the situation was no longer about who had been chosen, it was about whether that choice could actually stand on its own. And Olivia shifted again, this time not leaning forward, not asserting control, but sitting back slightly as if recalculating, and I could see it in her eyes, the realization that this was no longer a presentation, no longer a moment she could perform her way through, this was something she had to prove. And my father cleared his throat quietly, the sound cutting through the tension just enough to signal he was stepping back into the conversation. But when he spoke, it was different, slower, more measured. "Then we evaluate it," he said, as if reframing the situation into something he could manage, something structured, something he could still control, and I nodded once, because that was exactly what the trust required, not approval, not assumption, evaluation, and my mother leaned forward slightly, her voice softer again, controlled but careful. "Emily, you know what your sister has done for this company," she said. And that sentence alone carried years of unspoken comparison, years of positioning Olivia as the visible success, the one everyone pointed to, the one they built narratives around, and I did not interrupt her. I let her finish because I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life, but this time, for the first time, it did not carry the same weight, because visibility and understanding were not the same thing, and Olivia straightened slightly, taking that as her opening. "I have been in every major meeting for the past 5 years," she said, her tone returning to something closer to confidence. "I have worked with every department head, every investor, every expansion plan." And she was not wrong. She had been there, she had been seen, she had been positioned exactly where they wanted her to be, and that had always been enough until now, and I let her finish before I spoke because timing mattered, not just what you said but when you said it. "And how does the company handle risk exposure across its logistics network?" I asked, and the question landed immediately, not loudly but with precision, because it was not a surface question, it was not something you answered with general knowledge, and Olivia paused just for a second, but it was enough for the room to feel it, enough for my father's expression to tighten slightly, and she recovered quickly. "We have protocols in place," she said, but it was vague, too vague, and I did not push harder. I just continued. "What determines which routes get prioritized when capacity is limited?" I asked, and this time the pause was longer, not dramatic, not obvious but undeniable, because now it was not just one question, it was a pattern, a direction, and Michael remained silent, but his attention sharpened, following the exchange closely, because he understood what was happening. This was not an argument, this was the evaluation the trust required. And Olivia's confidence shifted again, not gone, but strained. "Those decisions are made by the operations team," she said, and I nodded slightly because that was true but incomplete, and that was the difference. "Based on what criteria?" I asked, and this time she did not answer right away, and that silence spread across the room again, heavier now, because it was no longer theoretical, it was visible, measurable, and my mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing briefly at my father, as if expecting him to step in, to redirect, to protect the situation they had built. But he did not this time, because he understood now what this meant. This was not about defending Olivia. This was about whether the transfer could legally stand. And for the first time I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Not control, not certainty, but doubt. And I did not need to press harder. I did not need to prove anything through volume or force, because the structure was already doing that for me. And as Olivia finally spoke again, her voice quieter, more careful, "We can go through all of this in detail later," she said, trying to move past the moment, trying to push it forward, but I shook my head slightly. "The trust does not allow later," I said, and that was the final shift, the point where the reality they had been trying to hold on to could not stretch any further, because this was not something they could delay, not something they could reframe. It was happening now, in this room, in front of everyone, and I realized as I stood there watching them adjust, watching them recalibrate in real time, that the position I had been placed in was not just about stopping a decision, it was about defining what came next, and they were only just beginning to understand that the outcome they had already accepted was no longer guaranteed. The room did not recover from that moment. It adjusted, it shifted, but it did not recover, because once doubt enters a space built on certainty, it does not leave easily, it lingers, it spreads, and I could see it now in every small movement around the table. The way my mother's fingers tightened slightly against each other, the way Olivia avoided looking directly at me for more than a second, the way my father leaned back just enough to observe instead of control, and that alone told me everything had changed, because he was no longer leading the room, he was studying it. And Olivia tried again, this time slower, more careful. "This is not how leadership is evaluated," she said, her voice quieter but sharper, like she was trying to redefine the rules mid-game, and I understood why, because if she could change the definition she could regain control. But I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. "It is how this transfer is evaluated," I said, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it removed opinion from the equation entirely. And Michael nodded once, subtly, confirming it without needing to speak, and Olivia exhaled slowly, her composure still there but strained now, stretched thinner than before. "Then ask your questions," she said, and that was the moment everything shifted fully into place, because she had just accepted the terms, even if she did not realize it, and I did not rush, I did not fire off questions. I let the silence sit just long enough to remind everyone that this was not a performance. This was not something to rush through, and then I spoke again. "When a client contract fails to meet margin requirements, what determines whether we renegotiate or terminate?" I asked, and this time there was no immediate answer, no quick recovery, just a pause that stretched slightly longer than the last one, and Olivia's eyes moved briefly toward my father, not obviously, not enough to call out, but enough for me to see it, and that was all I needed, because the answer was not just knowledge, it was instinct built from exposure, from repetition, from understanding patterns over time. And she spoke finally. "That depends on the situation," she said, but again it was general, it lacked the detail that mattered, and I nodded slightly, not correcting, just continuing. "What situation?" I asked, and this time the silence deepened because now it was clear this was not about one missed answer, this was about a gap, and my mother shifted again. Her voice softer but carrying a note of urgency now. "Emily, this is not necessary," she said, and I met her gaze calmly. "It is exactly what the trust requires," I replied, and that ended that, because there was no arguing with a condition written into a legal structure none of them had fully understood until now, and Michael leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged, not intervening but witnessing, because this was the evaluation taking place exactly as it had been designed to, and Olivia's composure slipped just a fraction more, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for the room to feel it. "You are turning this into something it is not," she said, but there was no conviction behind it anymore. And I shook my head again. "No," I said. "I am showing what it has always been." And that was the truth they had been avoiding, because the company was never just a title, never just a position, it was a system, a structure, something that required more than presence to understand, and my father finally spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter, more measured than I had ever heard it. "What would you do?" he asked, and the question hung there. Not directed at Olivia, not at anyone else, but at me, and that was the moment everything shifted one more time, because it was no longer about whether I could stop the transfer, it was about what I would choose to do with the authority I had, and I answered without hesitation, not to prove anything, not to demonstrate control, but because I knew the answer. I would evaluate the long-term impact on network stability before making that decision, I said, because short-term margins do not matter if they compromise operational integrity. And the room absorbed that. Quietly, not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply, because it was not just an answer, it was understanding, and for the first time since this began, no one interrupted, no one redirected, no one tried to take control of the moment because they could not, and as I looked around the table at the people who had decided for years that I did not belong in this space, I realized something that settled firmly into place. They were no longer deciding anything, they were waiting, and what they were waiting for was something they had never expected to need, my decision. The question I had answered did not just sit in the room, it settled into it like something permanent, something that could not be undone once it was understood, and no one moved right away, not my father, not my mother, not even Olivia, because for the first time this was no longer about perception, it was about comparison, and comparison does not rely on opinion, it reveals itself whether you want it to or not. And Olivia shifted slightly in her seat, her posture changing again, less composed now, more defensive. "You are acting like I do not understand the company," she said, and there was frustration in her voice now, controlled but unmistakable, and I did not respond immediately, because this was not about arguing with her. It was about letting the reality of the situation continue to unfold on its own, and my father finally leaned forward again, his hands resting on the table, his eyes moving between us, calculating, adjusting, trying to find a way to stabilize what had already begun to shift beyond his control. "This is not a test," he said, his tone firm but quieter than before. "This is a transition." And I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw something I had never seen before, not authority, not certainty, but restraint, as if he understood that pushing too hard in the wrong direction would make things worse, not better, and I nodded slightly. "It is both," I said, and that answer did not challenge him, it corrected the assumption, and Michael remained still, but his attention was fully engaged, following every word, every shift, because this was no longer a routine legal process, this was the structure revealing itself exactly as it had been designed to do. And my mother spoke again, her voice softer, almost careful now. "Emily, we can work through this together," she said, and that word together felt different now, not inclusive but strategic, as if she was trying to reframe the dynamic into something manageable again, something familiar. But I did not respond to that directly because this was not about restoring comfort, it was about maintaining clarity, and Olivia exhaled sharply, her patience thinning. "What exactly do you want?" she asked, and that question hung there, not just directed at me, but at the situation itself, because they still believed this was about negotiation, about desire, about something that could be traded or adjusted, and I shook my head slightly. "This is not about what I want," I said, and that answer shifted the room again, subtly but definitively, because it removed the idea of personal gain from the equation entirely, and I continued, "It is about whether this transfer meets the conditions set by the trust." And that was the line that mattered, the one that grounded everything back into the structure they could not argue with, and my father leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze steady on me. "And does it?" he asked, and there was no challenge in his voice now, no dismissal, just a question, direct and unavoidable. And I did not answer immediately, not because I needed time, but because the weight of the answer deserved space, and as I looked at Olivia, at the way she held herself, at the way she had been placed into this position rather than built into it, I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me for years, that leadership is not assigned, it is recognized through understanding, through decisions, through the ability to see what others miss, and I turned back to my father, my voice calm, steady. "Not yet," I said, and that was the truth, not harsh, not dramatic, just precise, and Olivia's reaction was immediate. "That is not your decision to make," she said, but even as she said it, the certainty was gone, because the document sitting on the table had already proven otherwise, and Michael spoke then, not loudly, not forcefully, but with enough clarity to settle the point completely. "It is," he said, and the room went still again, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in acceptance of something they could no longer deny. And I could feel it now, the full shift, the reversal that had been building since the moment I walked into the room, because this was no longer about them deciding my place, it was about me defining the outcome, and for the first time they were not leading, they were waiting, and what they were waiting for was something none of them had ever needed before, my approval. And as that realization settled into the room, I understood that this was not the end of the conflict, it was the moment it truly began. Because now the question was not whether I had the authority, the question was what I would do with it. The words "not yet" did not fade, they stayed in the room, quiet but heavy, and I could see the way each person reacted to them differently. My mother looked down at the table as if trying to process how something so simple could shift so much. My father remained still, but his eyes sharpened, not with anger but with calculation, and Olivia leaned forward again, this time faster, more urgent. "Then what does that mean?" she asked. And this was the first time her voice carried something she had never needed before, uncertainty, and I did not rush to answer because this was not a moment to fill silence. This was a moment to let it work, to let them feel exactly where they stood, and when I finally spoke, my voice stayed calm, steady, unchanged. "It means the transfer does not move forward today," I said, and that landed differently than anything before it, because it was not theoretical, it was immediate. It was real, and my father's posture shifted again, this time forward, his hands pressing lightly against the table. "That is not acceptable," he said, but even as he said it, there was less force behind it than there used to be, because this was no longer something he could override, and Michael did not interrupt, but his presence reinforced the reality of it. The structure was already in place, and Olivia shook her head slightly, frustration rising now. "You are delaying something that has already been decided," she said. And I met her gaze directly, not reacting to the tone, not matching it, just holding steady. "No," I said, "I am preventing something that has not been completed." And that distinction mattered because decision and completion were not the same thing anymore. And my mother looked at me again, her voice softer, almost careful. "Emily, what are you asking for?" she said, and that question was different from before, not "what do you want," but "what are you asking for?" And I understood the shift. They were beginning to see this as a process they had to move through, not a situation they could control, and I answered clearly, without hesitation. "Time," I said, and that word settled into the room in a way nothing else had, because time meant delay, time meant uncertainty, time meant losing control of the narrative they had already built, and Olivia reacted immediately. "For what?" she asked, and there was tension in her voice now, not hidden anymore, and I kept my tone even. "For evaluation," I said. "For review of operational decisions, for demonstration of understanding." And as I spoke, I could see it, the shift happening again, not just in them but in the room itself, because this was no longer a single moment, it was becoming a process, something that would extend beyond this meeting, beyond this table. and my father exhaled slowly, leaning back again, and this time he did not argue immediately, he considered it, and that alone told me how much had changed, because before today, he would have shut this down without hesitation, and now he was thinking. And Michael finally spoke again, his voice calm but definitive. The trust allows for a review period if the beneficiary determines further evaluation is required, he said, and that was the confirmation that locked everything into place, because it was not my opinion, it was the structure. And my mother closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, her expression composed but different now, more aware, more cautious, and Olivia leaned back in her chair, her frustration still there but contained, because she understood now that pushing harder would not change the rules. And I realized something in that moment that my grandmother had tried to show me all along, that control does not come from being the loudest voice in the room, it comes from understanding the system that defines the room itself. And as I looked at all of them, at the people who had built a future without me and were now forced to pause because of me, I understood that this was not just a delay, it was a reset, a shift in direction they could not ignore. And for the first time, the timeline they had created no longer belonged to them, it belonged to me, and what happened next would not be rushed, it would not be assumed, it would be decided, carefully, deliberately, and entirely on terms they had never planned for. The word time did not end the meeting, it changed it, and that difference became clear in the way no one stood up, no one gathered their things, no one tried to close the conversation, because they all understood this was no longer a moment that could be wrapped up neatly. It had opened something that would continue whether they wanted it to or not, and my father looked at me again, longer this time, not just observing but reassessing, as if he was trying to understand how he had missed something this significant for so long. How long? He asked, and his voice was steady, controlled, but there was something else underneath it now, something quieter, something closer to caution, and I answered without hesitation. 30 days, I said, and that number settled immediately, specific enough to be real, long enough to matter, and Olivia reacted first, her head turning sharply toward me. That is excessive, she said, but there was less authority behind it than before, because now she was responding, not directing, and I kept my tone even. It is structured, I said. The review needs to cover operational performance, risk management, and decision-making under pressure. And as I spoke, I could see the shift continuing, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like something realigning piece by piece, and my mother leaned forward slightly, her voice measured. And during that time, she asked, "What happens to the company?" And that question mattered because it revealed what they were really concerned about, not just control but stability, and I nodded once because I had already thought about that. Nothing changes, I said. Existing leadership remains in place, all current operations continue without interruption. And that answer eased something in the room just slightly because it removed the immediate risk, the fear of disruption, and my father exhaled slowly, leaning back again, processing, recalculating, and for a moment no one spoke because the situation had moved beyond reaction into something more deliberate, something that required thought instead of instinct. And then he said something I did not expect, not because of the words but because of how he said them. And at the end of those 30 days, he asked, "You make the decision?" And I met his gaze, steady, clear. "Yes," I said, and that was the moment the reality settled fully into place, not just for them but for me as well, because until now this had been about stopping something, about correcting something, but now it was about choosing something, and that carried a different kind of weight, one that did not disappear when the meeting ended, one that would follow every step from here forward. And Olivia looked at me again, her expression no longer just frustrated but searching, as if she was trying to understand how the situation had shifted so completely. "And what exactly are you looking for?" she asked, and this time there was no accusation in her voice, no edge, just a question, direct and uncertain. And I answered simply because the answer was simple, even if the process was not. "Understanding," I said. "Not just of the company but of how decisions impact it long term." And that answer did not challenge her, it did not diminish her, but it also did not give her anything to hold on to, because it was not something she could claim without demonstrating it. And Michael nodded slightly, confirming again without needing to speak, and my mother sat back slowly, her hands resting in her lap, her expression composed but thoughtful, and my father remained still, his gaze steady, his posture no longer commanding the room but part of it. And I realized in that moment that the shift was complete, not because I had taken control in a dramatic way, but because the system had placed responsibility in my hands and everyone else had recognized it, even if they did not fully accept it yet. And as the silence returned, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, I understood something that my grandmother had been preparing me. For all along, that power is not in the moment you reveal it, it is in what you do after, and now for the first time the next step was not theirs to decide, it was mine, and whatever happened in the next 30 days would not just determine the future of the company, it would define the roles each of us would carry moving forward, whether they were ready for that or not. The meeting did not end with a clear conclusion, it ended with something far more unsettling for everyone in that room, uncertainty that could not be resolved in a single conversation, and as chairs slowly shifted and papers were gathered without urgency, I could feel the difference in how people moved around me, not avoiding, not dismissing, but aware in a way they had never been before, and my father was the last to stand. His movements deliberate, controlled, but not as certain as they once were. "We will reconvene in 30 days, he said, his voice steady enough to sound like a decision, even though we all knew it was not his to make anymore, and no one challenged it, not because they agreed, but because the structure had already dictated the outcome. And as the room began to clear, Olivia remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting on the table, her gaze fixed on the document in front of her, as if she was trying to understand how something so familiar could suddenly feel so unfamiliar. And when she finally stood, she did not look at me right away, not out of avoidance but out of recalculation, and when she did, her expression was different, not just frustrated, not just unsettled, but searching. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice quieter now, and I shook my head slightly. "I knew it could happen," I replied, and that distinction mattered, because this was never about setting a trap, it was about understanding a system that had always been there waiting to be seen. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. "And now you get to decide everything," she said, and there was no accusation in it this time, just a statement, and I met her gaze calmly. "No," I said, "I get to evaluate." And that correction landed softly but firmly, because it reframed the situation again, not as power but as responsibility, and she nodded once, almost to herself, before turning and walking toward the door, leaving without another word, and that alone said more than anything. She could have added, because it meant she understood at least partially what had shifted. And my mother approached me next, her expression composed but thoughtful. "This does not have to divide us," she said, and I recognized the intention behind it. The attempt to maintain something familiar, something controlled, but I did not respond with reassurance, not because I wanted distance, but because this was not something that could be smoothed over with words. "It is not about division," I said. "It is about clarity." And she held my gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing that, before giving a small nod and stepping away. And then it was just my father and me, standing across from each other in a room that had changed more in the last hour than it had in years. And he looked at me in a way I had never experienced before, not as someone to correct or guide, but as someone to understand. "You have been preparing for this," he said, not as a question but as a realization, and I did not deny it. "I have been learning," I replied, and he nodded slowly, taking that in, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because there was nothing immediate to resolve, nothing left to control, only the acknowledgement of what had already shifted. And as I turned to leave, I felt something settle into place, not triumph, not victory, but something steadier, something more grounded, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a process that would test more than just knowledge. It would test judgment, consistency, and the ability to see beyond what was visible. And as I stepped out into the hallway, the same one I had stood in just hours before, I realized how much had changed without anything physically moving, because the door behind me no longer separated me from the room. It connected me to it in a way it never had before, and for the first time, I was not standing outside waiting to be included. I was walking forward knowing that what came next would not be decided without me, and that was something none of them had planned for, but something they would all have to face in the days ahead. 30 days does not sound like a long time until every decision starts to matter, and by the end of the first week I realized something my grandmother had always known, that understanding a system is one thing, but carrying responsibility for it changes everything. And I did not step into the company as someone new, I stepped in quietly, the same way I always had, but this time nothing was invisible anymore. Every department head knew why I was there, every meeting I attended carried a different weight, and for the first time, no one questioned my presence. They adjusted to it, and that alone shifted more than any announcement ever could. And Olivia adapted quickly, I will give her that. She showed up earlier, stayed later, asked more questions than I had ever heard her ask before, not surface questions but deeper ones, and I watched it carefully, not looking for mistakes, not waiting for failure, but evaluating exactly what the trust required, understanding, not performance. And there were moments, small ones at first, where she surprised me, where she connected pieces I did not expect her to see, and those moments mattered not because they proved anything immediately, but because they showed potential, and potential is something my grandmother had always valued. But there were also gaps, not dramatic ones, not obvious to everyone, but clear when you knew where to look, decisions that leaned toward short-term gains without fully accounting for long-term impact, assumptions made based on visibility rather than structure. And I documented all of it, not emotionally, not personally, just clearly, because this was not about proving someone right or wrong. It was about making a decision that would hold long after this moment passed. And my father watched everything without interfering, which may have been the most surprising part of all, because he understood now that stepping in would not change the outcome. It would only reveal that he did not trust the system he had built. And my mother moved differently too, more observant, less directive, as if she was learning something she had not expected to need. And the company itself did not slow down. It never does. Operations continued, contracts moved forward, decisions had to be made every day, and that was where everything became clear, not in meetings, not in conversations, but in the moments where choices carried consequences. And by the time the 30th day arrived, there was no dramatic realization waiting for me, no sudden shift, just clarity built piece by piece over time. And when we all sat down again in that same conference room, the air felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, because this was no longer about possibility, it was about conclusion. And my father looked at me first, not as a formality, but because he understood that this was where the decision began. And Olivia sat across from me, composed, steady, not the same as before, but not entirely different either. And Michael placed the document on the table again, the same one that had stopped everything 30 days ago. And for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify, only something to decide. And I looked at Olivia, not as competition, not as opposition, but as someone who had been placed in a position she was still growing into. And I thought about everything I had seen, everything I had learned, everything my grandmother had tried to teach me. And then I spoke, my voice calm, steady, final. The transfer can proceed, I said, and the room did not react immediately because they were waiting for the rest of it. And I continued, with conditions. And that was where the decision truly took shape, not as a reversal, not as a victory, but as a structure, the same kind my grandmother had built, one that did not just assign control but defined how it was carried. And as I outlined the terms oversight, performance benchmarks, shared authority during the transition period, I saw it, not resistance, not relief, but understanding settling across the table, because this was not about taking something away. It was about ensuring it was handled correctly. And when I finally signed the document, the same one that had stopped everything before, I realized something that had taken me years to understand, that being overlooked had never meant I was unimportant. It had simply meant I was not being seen yet. And now that I was, everything had changed, not just for me but for all of us, because the system they trusted had revealed something none of them had expected, that the person they dismissed was the one who ensured everything moved forward the right way. And as the pen left the paper, I understood that this was not the end of the story, it was the moment it finally began.